In this video, we're going to be looking at the very beginning sections of Chapter 1, talking a little bit about what microbes are and some of the ways that microbes are important to humans. So let's get started. So microbiology is the study of microorganisms. And microorganisms sometimes are called microbes. So you're going to hear me use those two terms interchangeably. Microbes are living organisms that are so small that we cannot see them individually with the living eye. Instead, we have to use some sort of magnifying instrument, usually a microscope, to look at them. And they include a huge variety of organisms, from the bacteria, and here is an electron micrograph of bacteria. Now that's not the real colors of those bacteria. Electron microscopes can only make black and white images, and so these are ones that have been colorized after the image was taken. They also include things like fungi. So here is a microscopic fungus as well. We can see the big fluffy thing here, this part, is the fruiting body. So that's where the portion of the fungus that makes spores. And then back in the background, these kind of rod-looking things that are back there, those are the fungal hyphae, the cellular structures that the growing parts of the fungus. So again, microscopic, looking at it under an electron microscope. Protists are also microbial. They include, when we use that term protist, and we'll talk a lot more about that a couple of chapters from now, we're talking about a whole bunch of not even really closely related organisms that are all single cellular. Some of them are referred to as protozoa. These are the ones that generally, not always, but generally are not photosynthetic and move about consuming their prey. The algae are the single-celled protists that are photosynthetic. So here is an algal cell, again falsely colorized green, although it is also green in real life. And using a light microscope here, we're looking at an amoeba, a protozoan. Amoeba kind of ooze around looking for things that they can engulf with these extensions of their cell membrane. They're called pseudopods, and these pseudopods they use to kind of wrap around and engulf some prey items, frequently bacteria or algal cells. Viruses, and again, electron micrograph of a virus here. This particular virus is a type that actually attacks bacteria and takes over the functions of the bacterial cell to make more of its virus self. And then finally, there are some animals that we study in microbiology because they serve as vectors of disease, or they're internal parasites of humans or other organisms, other animals usually. And so that's what we're looking at here. Again, an electron micrograph, this time of the anterior end, sort of the front end of a tapeworm. And this region of the tapeworm, that front end, is called the scolex. And here, the scolex, you can see its hooks and the suckers. So these kind of barbs, recurved barbs that it has here, help to like cling into or grab a hold of the interior of the intestine. And then these suckers also help to latch on to the wall of the intestine. And so that way the tapeworm can hold on and then grow inside the intestine, absorbing nutrients from all of the stuff around it. So that's an example of a parasitic organism that is studied in microbiology. So just again, brief history of microbes. Very brief, 3 bullet points here. The Earth was formed something like 4.6 billion years ago. That's just an inconceivable amount of time ago. But it was, and this is in pretty late in the development of the universe, because the universe first formed, something like 14 billion years ago, give or take. So about 4.6 billion years ago, a cluster of universal dust matter stuff coalesced, condensed, and formed the Earth. And for a long time, the Earth was completely abiotic, without any kind of life. But about 3.4 billion years ago, it's estimated, the first life formed on the Earth. And it was a kind of life called, that we think of as prokaryotic life. So these are single-celled organisms that were very simple in structure. They didn't even have a nucleus. Now, they had DNA. Prokaryotes have DNA, but no nucleus. And there are still prokaryotic representatives of organisms around the world. In fact, they are by far the most abundant organisms in the world, these prokaryotes that are the descendants of these first prokaryotic cells that came around about 3.4 billion years ago. So much later, then, through some evolutionary changes, and we'll talk about these eventually, these prokaryotic life forms gave rise to what we talk about as eukaryotic life. Now, humans, us, we are eukaryotes. We have nuclei in our cells. And so, but the early eukaryotic life that arose was unicellular, just like the prokaryotes are even today. And but through these evolutionary accidents, eukaryotic life arose, and that happened, again, still just an inconceivably long time ago, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion years. That's billion with a B, years ago. So super long time ago, we saw the development of early eukaryotic life forms. And through time and evolution, we come to where we are in the present day, where we're studying, sentient, multicellular eukaryote, are trying to study and make sense of the great diversity of microbial life. So why study microbial life? Well, microbes play just a huge role in the human environment, and so it makes sense for us to be really interested in microbes and how they function, because there's just so much of our life that really depends on microbial organisms. So, for instance, and here are like a bunch of different ways that we depend on microbes. The algae are responsible for capturing so much of the light energy that comes from the sun and taking that physical energy in light and converting it into the chemical energy that we find in glucose. So that's the food that the algae produce. And so as the producers in all food webs, or in all the aquatic food webs, algae are super important, because they're down there at the very bottom. They're the thing that produces the bulk of the food that can then be consumed by the consumers in these food webs. They also play a role in producing forms of nitrogen that can be used to nourish plants. So in the roots of many plant species, there are these nodules that contain bacteria that are capable of taking nitrogen gas into gas. This is inorganic gas, or inorganic nitrogen. And these bacteria can fix that nitrogen that's found in the gas into organic molecules that are now bioavailable. And so the plants kind of play host then to these bacteria that are going to produce these nitrogen forms, essentially fertilizer, that they can use, that the plants can use then to build the proteins that are found in plant bodies. So remember the protozoa, the single-celled organisms that crawl around or swim around and eat other things. Well, the other things those protozoans are eating are their algal friends. So protozoa are frequently the next step in food chains, especially in aquatic environments, so ponds or salt water, freshwater creeks and streams. And so the protozoans are down there near the base of the food webs, consuming the algae that are making all of that food for that are in the environment. As well, when we go and mess up the environment, bacteria and fungi can be used to clean up those messes and to decompose all of the plant and animal waste materials that are left laying around. If it weren't for fungi and bacteria, we'd be well over our heads in undecomposed plant and animal materials and wastes. And so also when things like oil spills happen, we've discovered that there are bacteria that are capable of breaking that oil down. We generally think of oil as being toxic once it's out of the deep rock that it forms in and gets spread out on the ground. But there are some bacteria that are capable of digesting the oil, using the energy in it to grow themselves, and in the process breaking down and removing that oil. And last of all, of course, microbes are responsible for many, many diseases. But it's interesting, way less than actually, 1% of the microbes that we have discovered are responsible for human disease. But the ones that can damage us and kill us are very effective and are responsible for upwards of 20 million deaths every year. So lots of ways that the microbes in our environment are important to us. We also use them to produce chemicals. So for instance, bacteria and fungi are used to produce pharmaceuticals, either because they produce them naturally, these pharmaceutical-like materials, or because through genetic engineering we've been able to force them to do it for us. So antibiotics, insulin, and some of the hormones that are used as treatments are all have a bacterial or fungal source. We also use bacteria and fungi to produce industrial chemicals, materials like acetone. Nail polish remover is one use for acetone. Alcohol and biofuels and so many other things. It's involved in the production of high fructose corn syrup and just many, many industrial chemicals. We also use fungi to make food products, so beer, wine, bread. These are all, they all make use of yeast, and yeast is a type of fungi, to ferment the sugars that are found in the beginning places for beer, wine, and bread, and in the process make alcohols. If it's in the case of bread, because there's oxygen around, the yeast continue to break down the alcohol then and produce carbon dioxide that leavens the bread, that makes it rise. Vinegar is a fungal product. Blue cheeses, those streaks of blue, those are fungi. Tofu, yogurt, sauerkraut, any fermented material is a fungal product from yeasts. And bacteria also are important in our guts because they help to digest the foods that we eat and even give back to us some of the vitamins that we find really necessary. So vitamin K, for instance, is a product of bacterial activity in our gut. And viruses are even useful to us because they can be used to insert novel genetic material into living cells. So we can use the virus, who in its natural function would normally insert its own DNA into a cell. We can create viruses that have DNA in them that is useful to us, and we can use the virus then to insert that DNA into the cell. So lots and lots of genetic engineering is done through the use of viruses. Because all life evolved from very simple single-celled microbial organisms, Many of the life processes that we see in the organisms that are around us, the plants, the animals, the fungi, all of these multicellular organisms, they've got processes that are identical or at the very least similar to the life processes of the microbes. And so these are great study tools because they're very inexpensive to manage. You can conduct really large-scale experiments very cheaply using bacteria and other microbial forms of life. And in fact, because bacteria reproduce so quickly, we can see as many as three generations in just an hour. So that means they're dividing about once every 20 minutes. It doesn't take long to get a whole bunch of generations. And so experiments in genetic inheritance especially it's very useful to do those experiments using microbial life like bacteria. And finally, understanding the life processes of the pathogenic microbes that are in the world around us. Because we've used them and studied them, we've been able to lead to cause the near eradication of many of the diseases that we used to find very, very dangerous especially to young children. So many childhood diseases have been virtually eliminated here in the United States, and even some that are virtually eliminated worldwide because we now understand so much about how they act as pathogens. And then last of all, kind of the last point of this, is that microorganisms are just unbelievably abundant. If we could gather up all the bacteria that are found in the living realm of the earth, so at the surface of the earth and deep in the rocks, where, until you get so deep that there are no more living organisms. If we could gather all the bacteria, and we're just talking about bacteria here, not the fungi, not the protozoans. But if we could just gather up all those bacteria and weigh them, we would see that we've got something, a mass that far outweighs all the other living organisms in the world. So we're talking now about the redwood trees of California and all the blue whales out in the ocean. If we could gather up all of those organisms, anything that's not bacterial, the bacteria far outweigh the non-bacterial life. When you think about your own body, we have, the estimates vary between, I've seen as low as like 60 trillion cells to as many as more than 100 trillion cells in the human body. But we estimate that there are at least 10 times more bacteria and fungal cells living in and on the human body than there are human cells. So, we like to think of ourselves as being fully human, but really we are, there's 10 times more cells of bacteria and fungi in and on us than there are our own cells. We find bacteria living, we've found them living as deep as 5.2 kilometers below the Earth's surface. That is, I should have figured this out before, but that's a couple of miles down for sure. 10 kilometers is 6 miles, so yeah, that's 3 miles down that we're talking about below the Earth's surface. And there are guesses made by people who studied these kind of cryptobacteria that they may be as deep as 10 kilometers down, so approximately 6 miles down. They are capable of living in really extreme environments. So, imagine living in water that is hotter than even boiling water. So there are places deep in the ocean where the pressure is so great that water becomes superheated. We can get it hotter even than boiling. And there are scads of bacteria that are living in that environment. And again, because that's down there at those super deep depths, more than 5 miles below the surface of the water, the pressure down there is so extreme that we would be crushed. Humans can't survive outside of a submersible at that kind of depth. It's more than 800 times the pressure that we feel on our bodies here at the surface of the Earth. That's what I mean by an atmosphere. 1 atmosphere of pressure is the air pressure that we feel around us. So down 5 miles down below the ocean, all that water weighing down, that's more than 800 atmospheres. The bacteria are doing just fine down there. So they're incredibly abundant and capable of living in really, really extreme environments. So with all that being said, why study microbiology? I ask the question instead, how can we not study these really amazing organisms that are capable of such great diversity, such great numbers, and such interesting lives? So hopefully you are captured a little bit by all this and are ready to hop in a little bit more, like we'll see in the next video. So I'll catch you then.